mistake.
Yeah. So well, this would be easy to moderate because it's actually one of the last main panels of. I mean, this is the last hour we have for the convention. I mean, tomorrow we have a couple workshops, but this. So anyway, I'm hoping you're here for the Pastiche Panel, Sword and Sorcery. We might as well poll you. Have you guys heard of Pastiche before? I think we actually scared people away from that.
What's a pastiche?
I think I should have realized this. Maybe I didn't know this. I guess maybe a lot of people don't think about what pastiche actually is, and or know. Which so the name itself, people are like, what is it? Is that like a peanut or something? You know, like a pistachio? I don't know what it is.
Sword and Sorcery Pistachio?
Yeah. So. So I mean, the panel here is we're supposed to talk about Sword and Sorcery Pastiche, so we'll certainly delve into that. But really, the idea is how do you adopt someone's writing style and then and maybe repeat it. So,
Thank you.
Yeah, it's probably always a good time for. Well, we don't have pastiche in there necessarily, but we don't. I'm sure
this
it might come up.
What it might seem.
Yeah, right.
Officially, very much not.
Yeah.
That is not a famous barbarian of a particular.
Yeah, you don't know.
No.
Let's get sued.
So what we do first is, well, for you guys. So I'm Seth Lindberg. I'm one of the coordinators of the event, and I like to play with Sword and Sorcery when I can. We have this band of brothers here. We'll go through and introduce ourselves, and then we'll talk about stuff. So Howard,
sure.
give it a shot.
I'm Howard Andrew Jones, and I've lost my name tag someplace along with my umbrella. I'm the editor of Tales from the Magician's Skull. I write Sword and Sorcery for various publishers. Most recently, I just signed a book contract for Bane for a new Sword and Sorcery series that will be starting next August.
Yeah, 5 books.
Matt John. I work for Monolith Games, who publish the Conan board game. I've worked on the Modiphius Conan board game as well. Done some work for Nightfall Games, who are publishing the Terminator role-playing game. So I think that's what brings me here in terms of pastiche.
So I'm Jason Ray Carney. By the way, the reason why I use my middle name is because there is another English professor who's Jason Carney, and everyone thought I was him.
Oh man, he's gonna be so surprised. I've been tagging you on Facebook for the wrong time.
No.
It's the wrong way.
Well, it allows us to call you J Ray, which is fine.
So yeah, I teach English at Christopher Newport University. I'm the editor of Whetstone, amateur magazine of Sword and Sorcery. And I'm really fascinated by pastiche, just in general, the concept of pastiche. Why do authors do pastiche? What do we want out of pastiche? So yeah.
Okay. Well, I have a list of questions, and we have an hour to hang out together, and then or 50 minutes or something like that. But we should really cover what the hell is pastiche anyway, and why it scared people away from the panel or the coming. we actually had like 25 people sign up, but maybe Saturday dinner time's not the best time to compete against. But let's talk about what is pastiche, and maybe distinguish it too from things like fan fiction and stuff like that. So I don't know. You want to get started on this?
The term pastiche comes from academic painting, where there's and it's a French word, right? So it comes from French academic painting, where one of the ways that you train to become a painter, there was actually schools set up to train painters in the 19th century in France. You would study the great masters, and you would literally just paint the same painting, right, to kind of master the techniques like brush strokes and stuff. But so that's what it is. It's where you're trying to replicate a work of art. You're not trying to express your own voice. You're trying to replicate a work of art. But then that's not completely how we talk about it. We can, now it's evolved. It can mean all sorts of things. Like you can have a pastiche where it's not necessarily like if you're a novelist and you're writing a Robert E. Howard pastiche, you can say, well, I'm not going to try to replicate Howard's style, but I am going to try to be true to the themes and the content, right? And then some people say, well, no, pastiche is you have to completely replicate the style, right? You should not be in it. You should get yourself out of it as much as possible.
The voice should be identical and everything.
Yeah, I got into that. Well, not really got into it with Scott Oden, who's he's a sword and sorcery writer, great guy, great writer. And he was like, I think we had him on the podcast. He's like, well, that's not pastiche. Pastiche is when you are, as you described, trying to replicate the style. And he's like, what you're talking about is fan fiction. I'm like, well, maybe you're right from a pedantic standpoint, but as you say too, it really is about how we use the term. And I think when you think of those Tor Conan novels,
Yes.
you know,
Yeah.
those are referred to as pastiche, and a lot of those guys were not replicating Howard's style at all. And if that was what they were trying to do, well, they did not.
They failed.
I think that's one of the problems with, for instance, I guess the best example is that Tor pastiche. It seemed like they just grabbed anyone off the street who could write fantasy and said, hey, you write fantasy, why don't you write some Conan? Because if you're going to write good pastiche, it's not just that you have to be a capable writer. You have to be true to the character. You have to plot in a way that's similar to the writers writer who created the character. You have to use the world in a similar way. You have to be immersed in the world and the works. Otherwise, it just doesn't sound right. Now, there are some people who don't seem to notice if it doesn't sound right, and they'll be perfectly happy, which is sad. So I remember, for instance, the Dark Horse run on Conan. There were some issues, a big chunk of issues in the middle, which made me very sad. I didn't think they were very interesting. And then Roy Thomas came along. And the Roy Thomas issues all of a sudden was like, wow, the story is great, this is awesome. And most of the people online were complaining that the artist wasn't drawing Conan's muscles big enough. It's like, they didn't notice that the story had just gotten like 10 times better than it had been in ages. They just cared about whether or not Conan had big enough muscles. So, who are you trying to please? I think if you're writing the prose, if you're hired to write the pastiche, be faithful to the work, man. Try to bring similar kind of stuff, or get out.
Yeah, and I would add to that I'm a little. People who can write really great pastiche in the voice of Robert E. Howard, like Scott Oden, actually does that probably as well as anybody.
I would say actually that Oden actually can sound like Robert E. Howard.
Yeah.
There's some other guys I like who write really good Conan pastiche. Like, I think Hawking is great. Chris Hawking writes some wonderful pastiche because he gets the world, he gets the whole Weird Tales vibe.
Yeah.
He doesn't sound exactly like Conan as far as the way the words flow, but it feels like a Conan story because he understands it so thoroughly.
And both of them had a pastiche novella serialized in comics recently in the Marvel.
Right.
Yeah,
It's like
yeah.
a short story in the back, ongoing short story in the back of the Conan comics, and I was fortunate enough to get to edit those, which was awesome.
That's right.
Yeah.
And Scott actually, he would like the idea of the origins of pastiche, a painter painting the same thing. That's what he did for the Conan stories. He would just actually bang out the same words from Robert E. Howard so that he would commit it to memory and all the quirks and things like that. I guess what I was saying is that for me as a consumer and reader, it might be controversial to say, but I'm less interested in someone who can write a lot like Howard, or specifically, not this Howard, Robert E. Howard. Although that would be interesting. I mean, I like your writing very much, sir. But I like the idea of, I think what I like is more so fan fiction from a consumer standpoint, whereas you're an author with your own voice who takes these characters and plays around in these sandboxes in these worlds, with the caveat that it has to be good. It has to be good storytelling. It has to feel like the world. But I don't necessarily need the authorial voice to replicate it.
Yeah, I think John C. Hawking, on the one hand, is like gets the character, gets the world, gets the themes. You know, like it feels like it does feel very weird. Like the Emerald Lotus is very weird. On one side of the spectrum, and the other side would be Scott Oden's recent novella. And what was it in?
I think it was Savage Sword of Conan.
Yeah.
His was in.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Hawking's was in The Barbarian from a couple of years back.
Yep.
I personally think they're both valid. You know, like they're both,
agreed.
Yeah, we should maybe talk about. I was actually through connections at Tales and other stuff. I Yeah, go ahead. No, go
No, I
ahead.
just thought,
Yeah.
because we haven't talked about bad pastiche. Bad pastiche.
You got passion for this?
Oh, yeah, well,
Yeah.
anti-passion.
Yeah.
His muscly muscled.
Yeah, absolutely.
That kind of stuff.
This is the closest we got to him actually, taking on the Rage Against the Machine.
Yeah.
Type of,
There's this one pastiche, I can't remember the name of it, clearly I'm trying to forget it. Is a Conan pastiche,
Yeah.
where Conan takes on another name, he lives in this village, he's courting this woman, he gets a job, he hangs out in the temple. You guys know which one I'm talking about?
Is
It's
that
like
Spider Gun?
Spider God.
Yeah,
Oh,
that's it, yeah.
It's like Sinclair
Yes,
Lewis
it's the camp.
meets Conan the Barbarian. Like it's like
Yeah, don't ever sell it.
slice of life, Hyborian age, and it's like why do we? I never want to see Conan holding down a job, right? Like,
Yeah, on that I
Yeah.
completely agree. I just want to clarify. Yeah, I still want it to feel very much like Conan. It's just less important to me if the voice matches Howard.
yeah.
Robert E.
And we can complain about us breaking camp because he's not alive anymore. So.
Okay, there's kind of I don't know, a legal aspect to some of this, I think, that maybe. So I think and this is for aspiring writers too, you might want to emulate, Reed Howard or someone else. So I think a lot of Howard's work now is in the public domain, so you could take existing stories and you can reprint them, right? But there's trademark issues around the estate and creating new material, which you cannot do, and that's all mainly by Fred Malberg. It was, I guess, it's not Titan, it's Cabinet, I guess.
Yeah, Cabinet, Legendary, Heroic Signatures, and I'm not sure which is which, but they've got titles that Conan Properties is another one, and it's all them.
Right. And you're kind of playing in that arena as you make stories for the Conan board game. So, but I think there's a distinction if you want to make art like this, and emulate a story. You can. If you try to sell it, then it kind of goes from fan fiction to something that's in retail, and IP is really important. So Yeah. I don't know. Maybe you actually been in that process. I don't know. Maybe you could discuss. Anyone to go aspects of IP ownership and.
Yeah, I mean, I will say that there is a belief going on that because of when those stories were originally published, that it's fair game. I'm not a lawyer, a copyright lawyer by any stretch, but there's a difference between a copyright and a trademark too. And so, yes, anyone can pop the Robert E. Howard stories on Amazon, and print them under those titles. But if you put Conan on there, Conan is trademarked. You cannot do that. I know. And it's funny. Yeah, I run a group called Conan Gaming Group, and oftentimes publishers come there and they're like, "Oh, this is a great place for me to put my Hyborian Age Kickstarter I'm about to do, or my new Conan thing," and I'm like, "There's literally people there watching for you to do that, and we'll shut you down." And it's not to be cruel; it's just that people invest a lot of money in these characters, and so you have to protect these things. And honestly, we can have a debate about what's better, if it should be in public domain or if it should be open. Like, what would be better for the character? And I mean, personally, I would rather to have strong stewards of the property rather than everyone fair game. I think you can get diluted if it were to go that way.
Yeah.
So.
And there's more than Howard too, because in the Tales magazine, you've gotten some awesome new pastiches, which I think we should talk about besides Howard. Yeah.
We got the rights. We got the rights to do new Lonkmar stories. So I happen to believe that if you're going to be doing pastiche, you need to take good care of it. You need to shepherd it well. So before we even approached the Leiber estate, I approached a single author who I thought could do a great job doing it. And since I've been hanging out in the sword and sorcery field for longer than I care to admit at this point, I knew exactly the guy I wanted to use. And so I approached him, and Goodman Games, who runs Tales from the Magician's Skull, already had been working with the Leiber estate and developed a good relationship. So what we did is we asked Nathan we were going to pay Nathan regardless.
Nathan Long, yeah.
Yeah, Nathan Long, regardless of what the Leiber estate said. We paid him to write a story so that we could show it to the Leiber estate before we asked permission. It's like, look, why don't you look at this and see what you think? And Nathan was a huge fan and immersed in the world and the characters. And we went, Joseph and I looked at it a couple of times and offered little suggestions, brought it best we could. Then we showed it to the Leiber estate, and they said, "Oh, we really like this, go for it." And so we published one story. We've got another one in the queue. It'll be coming, I think, next issue. And there will be more to come. But I'd like to think that we handled that appropriately. If there is going to be pastiche, let it be shepherded, let it be guided, let someone edit it who gives a crap,
Yeah.
as opposed to, hey, I'm going to let anyone who writes for the Skull write Lockmar stories,
Yeah.
you know?
Well, you also had this, an Adrian Cole story for, right? Didn't you? For Elac of Atlantis?
so
Is that a different? That's a different.
Yeah, so Adrian Cole did that on his own.
Okay.
So Elac of Atlantis is one of the successors to the sword and sorcery style. That was Henry Kuttner for Weird Tales, and he only wrote 4 Elac stories way back in the day. I mean, this was when the original Weird Tales was in print. Clark Ashton Smith was still around writing stuff. Lovecraft was still in Weird Tales, so he wrote these 4 Elac stories. Well, in the modern day and age, Adrian Cole contacted the Kuttner estate and asked for the rights to write some more Elac stories. And he's been doing it steadily now. And I had nothing to do with the shepherding of this. Adrian does a perfectly fine job
Okay, so
shepherding.
he got the license or
He got the
and then
license to
got-
do it. Well, he got the permission,
Yeah.
and he gets the voice right. He gets the feel right, and he's been crafting. I'm not sure how many stories. There's been enough for a collection, but the collection doesn't even do all of them.
Okay.
He keeps writing them. But I was very pleased to get a couple of Elac stories in the Skull.
Are there maybe? Oh, go ahead.
You know, I was just gonna say that's Tales from the Magician's Skull. It's the finest magazine in sword and sorcery at the moment, and you should buy it. I don't get points for that. I'm just saying it because it's true.
There's several other biased panelists here that support
Yeah,
that.
that's true.
Are there other pastiches in the sword and sorcery recently that come? Those are the main ones that came to my mind, but maybe maybe
Can I add like a
as much as you want?
a
Yeah.
nuance?
Yeah.
Because there's also the issue of like homage, right? Like where like
Okay.
it's pastiche, but it's the names have been filed off, and like you have this whole period of the Conans. Have you guys heard that term before?
Oh, God, yes.
Some of them are really bad. Well, most of them are really
of
bad. Where they're clearly like this writer's, attempt to do Conan, but they first off they get a lot of them get it wrong. But I think it's a different dynamic. An homage means like I like this and I want more of it, so I'm going to do this for like the joy of it or something like that. I don't know if that distinction is useful or not. Homage versus
No,
pastiche.
It is.
it's interesting. So, for instance, Lynn Carter did a whole series of Callisto books, which are basically Burroughs Mars books with serial numbers filed off. And he did that from love because he loved the Edgar Rice Burroughs Mars books so much. He wanted to do something like it. It's the same thing, but it's not. It's the same concept. It's the same feel. Honestly, his plots are more variable than Burroughs Mars plots are. And I guess I could also cite Kygor. Kygor from Jungle Stories.
What a name.
Yeah. So people, for whatever reason, in the 40s and 50s, people were crazy for Tarzan stories. They wanted more. They couldn't get enough of them.
Yeah.
And Burroughs wasn't producing them fast enough. And so Jungle Stories was the longest sustained Burroughs ripoff with Kygor the Jungle Man. And there were oodles of them. And the weird thing is that about a third of them are really good. The other 2/3 are terrible. And I don't mean good like in this literary sense. You're not going to confuse it with, I don't know, Proust or even an adventure writer like Marlowe. But the best cliche jungle writing you could find, Lost Safari with dinosaurs.
Yeah.
It's
That
going
sounds awesome.
to hit every cliche, but it's going to be awesome. The problem is that a third of them are excellent, and then the other 2/3 are crap. So, unless you're getting a guided tour, the odds are if you pick one up, you're going to have a terrible time.
Do you have a Goodman Games article that indicates which ones are the good ones?
I actually have a blog on my website. If you just search for my name, Howard Andrew Jones, and then Kygor, Ki-Gor, you'll get my very opinionated take on which ones to bother with. And Altus Press is slowly reprinting all of them rather than a best of. And I think they're up to volume 4, where they're starting to get into some of the good ones.
Does Kygor refer to himself in the third person?
Well, see,
It seems like with that name.
there's sort of an evolution. So he does some of that me Tarzan, you Jane crap in the early ones. But the weird thing is with the good writers, he gets this bizarre nobility of spirit where he's larger than the story. It kind of transcends it. And then he has these loyal African friends who, this is the only way it's kind of ahead of its time. He calls them brother, and they call him brother. and
Oh,
they
cool.
they gladly risk their lives for one another. That's awesome. You don't. It's a magazine named mostly at white dudes in the 1940s, so you
Yeah.
don't expect that. And it reminds us that some of the prejudices we think were universal were not
Yeah,
universal.
sure.
People were complicated always.
Nice. Some of the discussion, I started thinking, we kind of neglected, there is a set of other comics too, and even board games that are continuing, the Conan tradition, and
Oh, yeah.
I don't know if you call that the pastiche if you start to switch medias, because that wouldn't be something that the original artist would have done, but.
Yeah.
Well, Burroughs did that. Burroughs was all about remediation, right? Like,
Yeah, how's that?
Isn't he famously like a businessman? I was talking to someone from the Burroughs.
Oh yeah,
Society.
he was really good at merchandising. I mean, he founded a town called Tarzana, right? Tarzana, California.
What's that before George Lucas did the whole Star Wars thing?
Oh, yeah.
Ed Burroughs was, okay.
Like several Tarzan movies. Some of them were really, really bad.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just as you were saying about the games, whether that's pastiche or not,
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think as far as the mediums are so different, you wouldn't call it that, but there are like scenario intros and things like that where whenever I'm writing those, I try to make sure it sounds, I don't try to completely, I don't pull a Scott Odin and read everything to try and be as Howard as possible, but I try to capture a bit of that tone, and I try not to do that because I would fail if I tried. But,
Well, it's really hard to do. That's
Yeah,
why
it
it's
is.
so amazing that Odin can do it so very well.
Yeah.
A lot of people will try. There's a whole lot of terrible Lovecraft pastiche. People will try to write like Lovecraft, and it just ends up. Well, let's face it, Lovecraft himself could be pretty turgid with his prose,
Yeah.
and it's like all they get is the turgid. They don't get the underlying excitement underneath.
a few uses of squamous. And,
Yeah. I use the word squamous. Now it sounds like Lovecraft.
Yeah,
I personally think that the best Lovecraft pastiche was written by Howard, The Black Stone. It's like
Yeah.
the best, and he was immersed in a correspondence with
Mhm.
Lovecraft at the time. But even though The Black Stone is Lovecraft's different because it's not the same character through every story, and he actually courted people to use his pseudo mythology. So like, please, reference Cthulhu, because that was part of the fun. It made it seem like the mythos was real. So I don't know if like something like The Black Stone or like Frank Belknap Long writing a mythos story is pastiche, but they definitely there's something there. I think it's in the direction of pastiche.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes, so there's, I guess, with the actual Conan properties, there's some new books coming out, right? So from, I guess, the,
S.M. Sterling.
yes, his is coming out just in a couple months, I think, right? So, Blood of the Serpent is coming out in October.
Yeah.
And I don't know if there's other ones that people know about. I know there's some comics too, and James was talking about. Yeah, go ahead.
Express like I want that novel to be awesome. I'm going to read it. I'm going to support it. I can't wait. But I'm a little suspicious because it's so long. Like, how do you do we have Hour of the Dragon, but like it's like 500 pages.
Yeah. Well,
I don't know if it's I don't know what it's linked, but it's a novel. It's not
You don't mean Hour of the Dragon's 500 pages. You mean that the
S.M.
novel is
Sterling,
going to
the
be
novel.
the
500
new
pages.
Conan novel.
right.
Yeah, because it's like this. If you're doing pastiche of Robert E. Howard, you should be writing in the short story. And this is
I'm hoping it's glorious, and I think that this stuff doesn't have to be absolute. Maybe it can be done, and who knows? Maybe it's a set of more serial adventures that are interlinked. We won't know.
Yeah.
Sterling is a good writer, and he loves the material. And man, fingers crossed. I hope it does great, because if it does great, then maybe we'll see Odin and Hawking and some other people get a chance to do their stuff with it as well.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think support of that novel is going to be key if that's the sort of thing you want to see. And I think maybe you read it, and if it doesn't happen to be to your taste, then you've done your job. But as a consumer, it's really important to support that book. And actually, I don't know. I think about that, and I don't know. Why? What? I know that the tradition is that the form is shorter, and that Hour of the Dragon is pretty much as long as that got. But is that necessary for Sword and Sorcery? Is that just what we've gotten and that's what we're used to?
Well, I think that we spend too much time talking about absolutes and
Yeah.
boundaries and borderlines, as opposed to just trying to capture the joy and excitement of Sword and Sorcery.
Yeah.
And if you say, well, Sword and Sorcery can only be this, or Sword and Sorcery can only be that, well, it's unlikely to succeed as a tea party with the Care Bears.
Coming soon.
Coming
He was-
soon.
yeah.
So I guess there have to be some boundaries. On the other hand, do you have to have a boundary that says it can only be one character? Do you have to have a boundary that says it can only be short? I think that stuff ought to be up for grabs. If people say, "Oh, you can only succeed with sword and sorcery in short form," it's like, okay, that sounds like a challenge to me.
Yeah.
Right?
Certainly elements of short story lend itself to the shorter
Well,
length.
yeah, it reminds me of. Sorry, I'm a Beatles nerd here. It reminds me, Paul McCartney was told he heard something about the Who back when the Beatles were together, that they had recorded this song that had the most distortion ever used, and they didn't think anyone could use more distortion than that. And he's like, "Oh wow, well, that sounds interesting. I'd like to write a song with a lot of distortion." So he goes and listens to
I
it.
said that was after Pink Floyd. Come on, man.
Well, he listens to it. It's like I could see for miles. And so he said, he basically says, "Who the hell was that? I'm going to write Hell to Skelton."
Yeah.
And so there you go, right?
I hitched my wagon to the Who instead, but we can talk about that later.
On the issue of the short form versus the novel form in Sword and Sorcery, like I think that the Hanabar stories, they feel like a long form. I mean, like you can read each episode independently, but reading them together, like you want to read them together. Like there's like a cohesiveness to the story. So it's weird. Is there like a middle space between like one short story and then move on to a completely different character? But there has to be a middle space between like a long story told over several episodes, because I think that's a unique thing.
Yeah, and you saying like that sounds like a challenge. To me, I think that if you were to do a longer form novel and it feels sword and sorcery, then that is going to be extra challenging, because something like Hour of the Dragon is so tight. Like every bit matters, it moves along at a pace. As soon as things get it all glacial, I think we're getting out of the spirit of sword and sorcery. So yeah, I think it can be done. Will it be? I would like to see. And that was a rhyme.
Okay. I had a couple topics I wanted to hit, and then if you guys start to have questions, start to raise your hand. It'll help me gauge when to switch to make sure we drag you into this. So I know for me a big rite of passage was I discovered Conan. I think it was the Lancer sets with Lynn Carter and the camp, and they kind of filled in the blank on some of the chronology of Howard, but they had these beautiful Frazetta covers, and it was presented like most of it was written by Howard, and someone like me, I didn't know the difference, and I love them. And it wasn't until 5-10 years later I saw online or somewhere these people were complaining about what was real and wasn't. I'm like, I didn't actually know the difference yet, other than it was a great way to get me in. And
Right.
so what maybe one of you guys can kind of capture what happened in those, and then talk about maybe when for some people Pastiche goes too far.
So Elsbreg de Camp and Lynn Carter, they took all the Conan stories, they put them in chronological order, and sometimes there were gaps, and they would take, sometimes they would write completely new stories, other times they would take a draft of a different character, like a boxing story, for example, and they would replace it to the Conan. Well, like in the 70s and 80s, a lot of Robert E. Howard fans were just up in our, Carl Edward Wagner, a sword and sorcery writer, he wouldn't use the term sword and sorcery, but Carl Edward Wagner was like, this is horrible, it's completely mistreating Howard's work, and he re-edited them to kind of return them to this like scattershot approach, but then we have the Del Rey, I won't go long, I promise I'll finish it. Then we have the Del Rey versions, which they're now told in the order that they were published. I think, this is being recorded, because I have a lot, I like reading them in chronological order. That's not weird, like I read them in chronological order, like I guess.
So when you're saying chronological, you mean in the order that they were written, rather than an artificial order imposed later to arrange it in order that
That's
it happened?
I think it's
like I actually enjoyed reading the Lancers, I mean, obviously I know that that Lynn Carter and Elsbreg de Camp shouldn't have edited them as much as they did, but maybe that's just like, there's a line that was crossed. But putting them in that saga it satisfies something in me as a reader. I'm not sure why. Like I liked having like the numbered books and reading one and setting it aside, and reading the next one, setting it aside, and so I think that we've moved beyond that point of like the what's it called, REH purism. Like it's like it's just snobbery. It's like maybe that period needed to happen, but now we're done with that. We've acknowledged that there were some lines that were crossed, but let's move on to like a little bit more intellectual hospitality, right?
I think as soon as those Del Reys came out, it was a moment where everyone could probably chill on the snobbery.
So to be clear, probably you guys know what the Del Reys are, but let's make it clear. So the Del Rey editions came out, and they were the actual texts without anyone else's work shoved into the middle. So
Yeah.
those are out there. For a long time, the only way you could get Conan was through the old Lancers, and even they had disappeared. So the only Conan on the shelf was just a whole bunch of Tor crap.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so now they've been in print for 10 or 12 years.
Yeah.
Well, not all of Tor Pastiche was terrible, but
No.
a good chunk of it was. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
It's not great.
Well, when he got a job.
Yeah, I mean, I wish I could go back in time and been the editor in charge. I would have made sure that I don't know what they were thinking. Anyway, so the Del Reys shepherded. Here's all the stuff as it was printed, curated with introductions and information and all the back history you would want to know. Anyway.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think too, I'm still today encountering people explaining that like the thing in the crypt is not a Robert E. Howard story, and that like, so I understand a bit with the snobbery because you didn't have those other editions, that everyone figured, and the sort of way that they sold it off as if it was all kind of Howard, and you couldn't tell who had written what story. It wasn't like Thing in the Crypt attributed to.
Yeah.
Oh, it does say it in the table of contents.
Does it?
Yes, it does.
There were some though. Maybe
Well, I think within a story, it was very hard to know, unless you knew the writing to know.
That's right.
'Cause
Yes,
yeah.
yes, you're right. But still, I guess it's that. So I understand. I'm a little sympathetic with the fact that there was nothing else there to differentiate.
Well, if
So-
you're 15 or you're 12, you just want to read the story. You're not
Yeah.
paying attention to the front matter. You're probably not reading the introduction.
Yeah.
It's like you want to get to the story.
Yeah.
You don't care.
And-
If you
and-
don't read the liner notes on the
Yeah.
album, you just listen to the album.
And I was that kid, and I think Curse of the Monolith is an awesome story, and I will still read that.
Really, what I think is a useful analogy just came to mind, which is that, like, you know, a sculpture is surrounded by the silk ropes at the museum, like, don't touch, keep your distance, versus pastiche, which is you're playing with the text, right? I think there's something in the spirit of pulp where, like, you can't take those silk ropes down and play with the text as writers and readers, you know, like, maybe that's sacrilegious to say, but I don't know. I think that if you look at the pulp origins of Sword and Sorcery, the readers sent their letters in. They had opinions. They would, some of these readers would become writers themselves. Like, there's this interactivity that is part of pulp, and I just don't think that Robert Howard is and Fritz Leiber and Jack Vance. They're artists, but they're not like. They're not written in that spirit of like Shakespearean, it's so alienating, we shouldn't approach it and it has to be protected. Maybe you need those Del Rey texts, and once you have them, then now you can do some pastiche.
Right.
Yeah.
To be writing pastiche and not have any of the original stuff available, that's wrong.
Yeah.
But if the original stuff is available and protected, anyone can get access to it, then yeah, go play.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But if you're going to have official stuff come out, then let's have some kind of
Quality control.
quality control. Thank you.
Okay, so I got one more question, then I'll start. Any questions out there yet? You guys, are we good so far? All right. So the one thing that I thought of this would be good in this panel would be to tap into you guys. Like, well, what pastiche could we have that we don't? For instance, I don't know. I thought about well, I don't know if we need Harold the Lamb pastiche, but what has that ever come to your mind? And I know you're huge in this whole academic history of literature. I have to imagine that there's one or two. You might want to maybe even play with yourself, and I'm curious.
What?
Yeah. So, no, I didn't say that.
Not
so
now.
Yeah, I'm talking about text here, but yeah. So, pastiche wise, I'm curious if.
So I have sometimes dreamed of writing some more Clip the Cossack stories, but I don't know that there's enough people reading Clip the Cossack stories to bother with, and I have my hands full writing all the stuff I've got. Right?
Yeah. Right.
I have more stories than I'm afraid I'll have time to write, so I'm writing them as quickly as I can and exercising a lot so I live for a really long time to write them. But yeah, I mean, sure, you read about these characters who inspire you, and sometimes you think, man, I would like to play with that. You see little holes in the story. There's a couple of other minor stuff I wouldn't mind trying, and I remember once thinking, man, it would be fun to write some original Star Trek stuff. There were some original Star Trek novels. A lot of those are just dreadful. It's like, were these people watching the same show I grew up with? Because that doesn't sound like something Kirk or Spock would say. They don't have a handle on McCoy, you know, et cetera, et cetera. It's like, man, that would be fun to do.
Yeah.
But I got other stuff to do, so I'm probably not going to get around to it. That said, if someone would come up to me and say, "Hey, Howard, we'd like you to be the story editor on the new Star Trek, the original series that we're going to reboot," I'd be like, "Okay, I'm out of here. I'm going to go take care of that for a few years. See you guys."
Yeah.
You know, that'd be a dream job.
I would say one of the things I do with the board games and the RPGs is to, and this is the part that I really like, is rereading the stories, and I mentioned this in another panel, kind of mining them for interesting bits that were not explored. And so I would say yes to doing that all day long. But then I don't really have to go in and write entire stories about it. But one thing that I would love to do is there's Bran McMorn. You have Worms of the Earth, which is like the last story we know about him, other than the Dark Man, which is kind of alluding to him as an idol, literally, later. But I would love to see what happened to Bran after Worms of the Earth, when he's gone a bridge too far, he's invoked dark spirits, he's done some heinous things, and you get a sense that he might be damned. And we know too that his people are damned, and that's an enticing idea for some horror infused sword and sorcery.
Well, actually, Carl Walker did a follow up.
Did he do after Worms of the Earth?
I haven't read the Pastiche.
That is good. I thought it was.
That's what I don't know. He did Legion of the Shadows or something, and there were serpent men involved. Or was that? Yeah. Anyways,
I think that's right. But
maybe
David,
it's been done.
David Smith and Tierney did another one, which as well. So
yeah, I read one of his. I did read that one. That was Witch of the Mists, I think.
Yes, correct.
But I don't think it alluded much to Worms of the Earth at all.
This is why we need things put in chronology, so we know,
Yeah, and I mean those are way out of print, and who knows if they'll ever be back, right?
I think Amaro would be really cool, like more Amaro stories.
Yeah.
Well, again, that needs to be curated though. Right now,
Yeah.
they're out of print, and actually, there's a number that were never properly collected.
So there's actually a book worth that is kind of hanging out there. That is.
Well, there's multiple book works. So there's
yeah.
four book length manuscripts, and then I don't know how many were uncollected. I don't know if it's just like 4 or if there'd be an entire.
No, I think there was. So he had the 4 main novels, and Saunders was selling like the last 2 or 3 on Lulu.
Right.
And then he had like another collection that was kind of set, that was basically a novel's length. They had some of the table of contents reviewed.
I think it's interesting. Sorry.
Yeah, no, you're good.
Well, even to mention Charles Saunders, what he did too, because he started writing some short sword and sorcery stories that were in some ways a reaction to Conan and Tarzan, and from sort of a black voice, right? And that's, again, we're talking about homage. You can see Conan and Tarzan in those, but they are absolutely distinct with their own flavor.
Right.
So that's if you've not read those stories,
Those are good.
absolutely
What's
check
really
them
sad
out.
is I did a tour guide for Blackgate trying to collect the different editions and how you should read them. And someone just posted recently, because after the passing of Saunders, which is really sad.
Yeah, recently, sadly.
His estate is pretty much up in the air. So someone reached out and said, "Well, are these links still valid?" And so I checked them out, and they're not. And I reached out to Milton Davis, who's published a lot of Saunders' work, and then also writes a lot of Sword and Soul. He was polite but very cryptic. But he pretty much said that even he doesn't know what the estate's up to right now, and he's as close as anyone is going to be. So it's one of those sad things where, actually, at the moment, if you didn't already have like books 3 and 4 of the Immortal Tales, which I did because I bought them earlier, but they're not available on Hulu anymore because his account is down, and he was he was running the printing, and so now they're just until the estate. Well, either you wait 75 or 150 years or whatever the new rule is. It's going to be ambiguous.
So the estate needs to figure out.
Yeah.
He died without heirs, so I don't know if it's like some remote aunt who has no interest in reading or sword and sorcery. Who knows what's going to happen? The same thing happened with the Kuttner and Moore estates. Henry Kuttner married C.L. Moore, and they were both these brilliant writers. And then Kuttner died very early of a heart attack, and then Moore married a man who didn't really like her to do any writing. This was in the 70s, so she did a few scripts. We didn't much care for fantasy, and then she died, and their children just didn't care about any of it. And then they were trying to get people to pay through the nose for any of these stories. And of course, people wouldn't pay through the nose for these stories because so much time had elapsed that no one remembered them anymore. So finally, I don't know exactly what happened behind the scenes, but the rights are much more affordable, but it's probably too late. Let us hope that doesn't happen with
Somehow Adrian Cole
Saunders,
yeah.
or actually, we were just discussing the Niftaline stories of Michael Shea have been out of print, and those need to get back into print before Shea is forgotten, because he's another brilliant writer who wrote some fabulous sword and sorcery stories that never had a large enough market, like Charles Saunders, and we need to get him back in print before it's too late.
Interestingly, I also reached out to Milton to see if he knew anything about the estate, and yeah, I got a similar answer to you. It was uncertain. I wanted to put Imaro in the Conan board game, so essentially be like a guest character that you could play as, because again, that's a helpful little signal boost in a big game like that. To have that character, and maybe we can still do it someday, and that'd be rad.
While we're talking about Milton, oh, get a question? Cool.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was thinking Milton's great. He writes a lot of sword and sorcery. He has several different types of heroes, and some are more I don't know.
Fantastical.
Yeah, and some are more chauvinistic, and others are more more civil. But he has one called Omari, and I said, oh, he's just doing a little I want to get the word wrong. Whenever you change the letters around, right? I'm like, this is actually Imaru, and he didn't know he did it actually. So I posted this review, and I said, oh, obviously Omari is a call out, to Imaru, and he was cracking up. He goes, no, I didn't even know I did it.
There's accidental pastiche.
Yeah.
Can I I'm sorry to take us to literary history, but like pastiche is probably we're talking about it like it's this unique form of literature, but if we go back to like heroic poetry, pastiche is the main mode of literature. Like if you were telling the story of Achilles, the ownership of that character was not like a single author, right? It was like you would share it, and the stories would proceed, and you would add a little bit. And it was an oral culture, but like this idea that like you're going to take Beowulf or Achilles or Homer, and you keep telling these same stories. Or there's so many, like in the tradition of heroic literature. Like I think sword and sorcery is kind of the modern version of heroic literature. Let's be honest. It's part of that, like being able to continue the saga of this character, because we don't want those characters to die, right? We want them to go on, And it's interesting. I don't know what to do with that, but I'm just thinking how like pastiche. It seems like it's this unique thing, but really it's actually. If you squint a little bit, it becomes the default thing that we've moved away from.
Yeah, that's a really interesting perspective.
Questions?
Yes.
So I just want to throw this out there as a topic. Some works that are written by older authors that there's still a demand for them, but they're essentially being held hostage by the publisher, like the Gore novels, for instance.
Gore.
Isn't that guy still writing?
He's still writing. He just wrote another one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think they're not in print anymore. Like there's not been new.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with the history on that, but he's in his 90s, but he just wrote one a year or so.
Oh, that's actually the original author writing that.
Yes, it is. Yes,
Wow.
it is. It's like The Simpsons. They're actually longer than The Simpsons.
Is it just like the Simpsons?
Is it?
It's zombie Simpsons.
So you've got a 90-year-old author writing some BDSM Sword and Planet stuff.
Yeah.
There you go. If you want to seek that out.
It's sad.
Well, I wonder if maybe I don't know. Maybe the publisher's changed over time. Maybe he has a different one, and I don't know.
But I think you were using that more of as an example rather than a specific instance.
Okay, yeah.
So it what can I say? It blows when the publisher has something and won't release it, and the audience is there. But I don't know what we can do with it.
You don't know anything about that, do you?
Gore?
Having a publisher not releasing something that you want released?
Don't even get him
Protest.
started.
I'm alluding to something.
There could be a long list. I have no idea what he's thinking about, but
We'll talk after.
yeah, but I know there's some. I know one. I was looking up to get a manuscript of.
Oh, I think I know who you're talking about. Okay.
Well, there was another question in back there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I consider myself fairly well read, but no one referenced authors that I haven't even heard of in some cases, and others that I have heard of. But you had mentioned trying to reintroduce their works, and one of the things I've noticed in modern publishing is they want a new release and then they basically stopped pushing books. So how would you, I mean, you would almost have to change the industry to sort of bring back or get sort of a recycling going to bring back some of the older works. I mean, how would you do that?
Well, there is certainly a fascination with the new and love of the new. I just signed with Bain, like I said last month. I've been talking to one of the editors, and he certainly seems interested in at least trying to bring Michael Shea back.
They actually, Bain had nice Michael Shea ones before.
Published Shea,
Yeah.
yeah. And after he died, they reverted the rights back to his widow. Shea's great, but he never had a huge following for whatever reason. But I think there might be interest in doing that. So it depends on the publisher. You need to get a publisher who's wanting to curate it. So maybe there's a sense. It would be nice if sometimes it feels to me like fantasy fans are only aware of what's been going on for the last 10 years, that there's not a sense of history or even pride in what's happened before, that we're just fascinated with the new. And it would be nice if there was some kind of, it's not just the industry's fault, we as readers have to like seek out some of the founders and and look at the great stuff that's happening.
Well, and we were talking earlier about we've got this like weird underground society we're all working on with
I mean, the skull cult?
yeah, the skull cult, the skull of the magician.
Some of us are
I mean,
believers,
there's
right?
even a holiday. I have my red candle.
The
Oh,
day
my
of
God.
might. But yeah, we have like I'm a host of Rogues in the House podcast. We talk a lot of sword and sorcery. We've had this man on, we've had that man on. This guy debuted today, and there's a Whetstone Discord group. And Whetstone is also an awesome little magazine that's published free, short, 2,500 max short stories. You know, this is new content coming out, but we're always talking about and championing these old authors. And so I would say, I would encourage anyone who has any interest in this sort of earthier sort of fantasy to seek those out and get involved. Like, we are a very friendly place, and we insist on that.
There used to be I don't know, is there still a zine culture where like fans could also try their hand at writing their own stuff? So like you had buy-in to the history, because when you're a writer, I'm not, I think I can say I'm a writer.
You are a writer, sir.
When you're a writer,
Stop that. Yeah.
you have to, you're also a scholar, right? You have to, if you're going to write in a tradition,
So
you have
something I
to.
noticed on your Discord and in Goodreads I noticed as well, every member of the community is both an avid reader and either an aspiring or an established writer. So like, it's interesting because every now and then some new people come in and they'll try to sell stuff, and then it's like, dude, okay, you're everyone here is actually in the same boat here. It's not all readers. It's not, a lot of these communities we have are actually around people who want. I don't know, there's this urge, once you read it, you want to recreate it yourself, I think. I don't know.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
But I don't know how you fight the real other companies, publishers that are after a market. So you're right. It's, the new stuff seems hot. So how do?
Yeah, it's a good question and a good point.
Yeah.
There's a reason I go to secondhand bookstores and dive through the paperbacks, because, I mean, there are books that I got lucky and was around 6 libraries when I was growing up.
Yeah.
And they all had a science fiction fantasy section that was just, they threw like $500 at a library and said, go find something.
Yeah,
And so I had a lot of access to stuff. But
and sadly, a lot of those.
common.
Yeah.
It's not fun.
Yeah, well, like, I remember when people were telling me to read Carl Edward Wagner, and I was like really excited to read it, and you could not find it. And then the only
Right.
ones that were reprinted were quite expensive Centipede press volumes. They're
Yeah,
beautiful,
right.
but
You want to spend $100 or something?
Yeah.
$60 a book, and now those are crazy expensive.
Right, if you try to get those on eBay, it's like, oh yeah, sure, I've got an extra $600 lying around to check out these stories someone told me were cool.
Yeah.
You can't even get them at the library. That's criminal.
Yeah.
I think maybe if stuff was available at least in ebook format, and there was some kind of consensus about, we've talked about literary canon. If there was some place to say, hey, these are the good ones, And not just a whole bunch
Yeah.
of wild opinions, but if there was like some kind of census, hey, these are the movers and shakers, check these out, and then if you like them, you explore these others. That would be cool.
Gores of the world.
Yeah.
I'm going to add to that about the jump out of my skin, because meeting you, I was guilty of only reading the old stuff, right? Like, I thought Sword and Sorcery was a historical genre, like maybe the 80s Carl Edward Buck, and then it had the famous the decline, and then lo and behold, people have been writing, Tales from the Magician's Skull, I always get the name right, the Desert of Eternity.
Desert of Souls.
Desert of Souls.
Souls.
I think I mixed it up.
You did get it wrong. Good job.
You're combining two titles. The short story collection I wrote was Waters of Eternity.
Yeah, but it's like trying to find that balance. I'm trying to find the balance of the other way, which is like reading the new stuff and supporting the new stuff, while also like reading the historical stuff. Because I just, like you, there's it's Half Price Books. Are they in Indianapolis? That was where I bought all of my books.
I'm from Texas, and Half Price Books is all over the place.
Yeah, they
Yeah.
found it in Texas. I used to work for them.
Cool.
Oh, nice.
You could also pick up a book like this called A Book of Blades, which is a lovely anthology of modern writers, including this guy, and this guy, and this guy, and this guy.
Yeah, it
connected
just
to our
went into
podcast.
print like 2 weeks ago. So
Yeah.
this is full of
Yeah.
modern writers who love the old stuff.
Yeah, and it's solid material too. Some of it's a snatch of reprints from people, like some of the really great stories in here. You can get it on Amazon, or you can come see me after. I have a few copies too.
I'm getting all signed.
Get
So
them
I'm getting this idea that they want us to close shop. But actually, I'm helping run this place. I know there's nothing next, so we can chill out, so whatever. We're good.
I actually have running I got to do, unfortunately.
Yeah, okay. All right, cool. So we'll close up shop. I'll give you guys have the 30-second goodbyes, and then we'll thank the panelists. Howard, you got 30 seconds to say something if you want? Or?
First, thanks for joining us here at the last panel of the day to talk about some of our favorite stuff. And if you ever want to talk about pastiche or sword and sorcery, new or old, you can contact me through my website at howardandrewjones.com, and I'd love to hear from you.
Yeah. Matt John, one of the hosts of the Rogues Nest podcast. I also write, and if you are into this kind of stuff, it's a wealth of information on there. I've got a little card if you want. You can come take that. It'll point you in the right direction. And of course, I highly recommend you pick up this book. The proceeds support the podcast, and we'll go back into making more cool stuff. It's not really for profit, as it were.
Jason?
Yeah, I'll just say Whetstone is, I founded it to basically get my friends who said they wanted to write, like, no excuse. So, like, it's only 2,500 words. We're very hospitable to, actually, we really like new writers. We like everyone, too, but, we like new writers. So
You also you have the Cosmic Horror analog as well, right?
Yeah.
It's another.
And it's, to make clear, it's Whetstone like a blade. You sharpen your blade on it. So
Yeah.
WHAT. And there's a fine Discord.
Is that how the Canadians say it?
It's just the Whetstone Discord. If you want to come and hang out and talk sword and sorcery there.
Yeah.
And you can read Whetstone is free, by the way.
Yeah.
It's free.
And it's digital. Look it up.
Submit a story.
Yeah.
That's all.
Yep, I think one thing about us is we all have different ways of trying to build the community, anywhere from magazines, podcasts, more magazines, and Discord, and Goodreads, and
He runs the good